Sarah Johnson adjusted her delicate framed glasses as she observed the stack of case files on her desk at the Community Services Center in Oak Ridge, Oregon. 25 years dedicated to social work had marked her face with lines that bore witness to both smiles and tears shared with those who sought her help. The March afternoon was particularly hot, and the ceiling fan spun lazily, barely managing to alleviate the heat that made sweat trickle down her forehead. Sarah grabbed a tissue from her purse to dry her face, feeling a slight dizziness as she leaned over. Lately, these strange sensations had been becoming more frequent, but she attributed them to fatigue and her intense routine. "Dr. Johnson." The voice of Mrs. Baker, the receptionist, interrupted her thoughts. "There's a lady here who really needs to speak with you. She didn't have an appointment, but she's very distressed." Sarah smiled, accustomed to the emergencies. That always arose. "You can send her in, Betty. You know we always find a way." The woman who entered her office carried in her arms a child who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. Her red eyes betrayed sleepless nights, and her simple clothes told stories of hardship. Sarah felt that familiar tightness in her chest, that desire to hug and protect that never diminished, even after so many years. "Please have a seat," Sarah indicated the chair in front of her. "How can I help?" "Doctor," the woman began, her voice choked. "My name is Emily, and this is my grandson Michael. My daughter, she..." The words were lost in sobs. Sarah rose from her chair, walked around the desk, and sat next to Emily, gently touching her shoulder. "Take a deep breath. I'm here to listen and help in any way I can." As Emily began to tell her story, a painfully familiar narrative of abandonment, drugs, and despair, Sarah felt that dizziness again, stronger this time. Cold sweat ran down her back, and an uncomfortable pressure began to form in her chest. "Are you all right, doctor?" Emily interrupted her narrative, concerned about Sarah's sudden paleness. "Yes, I just need to..." Sarah tried to stand up, but her legs didn't respond. The pressure in her chest turned into a sharp pain, as if 1,000 needles were being driven into her heart. Her vision began to darken at the edges, and the sounds around her became distant, as if she was submerging in deep waters. "Help!" Emily's cry echoed down the hallway of the center, bringing Mrs. Baker and other staff members running. Sarah still tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Her last conscious thought was a silent prayer. "Lord, I haven't finished my mission yet." Chaos ensued at the center. While some staff members called 911, others tried to help Sarah, who had slipped from the chair and was now on the floor. Mrs. Baker, with years of experience in emergency situations, began chest compressions, her hands trembling but determined. "Don't do this to us, doctor," Mrs. Baker muttered between compressions. "You're strong, you'll pull through." The minutes dragged on like hours until the ambulance arrived. The paramedics quickly took over, and the resuscitation ritual continued, on the way to Mercy General Hospital. In the emergency room, the medical team worked tirelessly, but after 21 minutes of attempts, the cardiac monitor still showed a flat line. "Time of death," the doctor began to pronounce when a weak beep interrupted his words. The line on the monitor trembled slightly, then more strongly, until establishing a regular rhythm. Sarah was coming back, but the person who would return wouldn't be the same as the one who left. During those 21 minutes, while her heart was stopped, she experienced something that would change not only her own life, but potentially the fate of many others. Her last words before losing consciousness again were just a whisper. "He's coming back. We need to prepare." The first sound Sarah heard upon waking was the rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the fluorescent light of the hospital room. A young nurse was adjusting the IV by her side and smiled when she noticed she had awakened. "Welcome back, Mrs. Johnson. You gave us quite a scare." Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. The nurse offered a cup of water with a straw, helping her drink slowly. After a few sips, she finally managed to articulate the words. How long?" "You were unconscious for 3 days," the nurse replied. "But the important thing is that you're recovering well. I'll call the doctor to examine you." As the nurse left, Sarah closed her eyes, and memories began to flow like an overflowing river. These weren't memories of the last few days in the hospital, but of the time she was... where? How could she describe that place that wasn't a place, that experience that transcended any human word? She remembered floating above her body, observing all the commotion at the center, then in the ambulance, and finally at the hospital. But that was just the beginning. What came after? The doctor entered the room, interrupting her reflections. Dr. Richards, as he introduced himself, was a middle-aged man with a gentle smile and attentive eyes. After examining her and asking several questions about how she felt, he sat in the chair beside the bed. "Mrs. Johnson, you were very lucky. It was a severe heart attack and your heart stopped for 21 minutes. It's a miracle you're here talking to me." "Doctor," Sarah began, her voice firmer now, "I need to tell you something important. During that time, I saw things. I experienced something that..." Dr. Richards nodded understandingly. "It's common for patients to report experiences during cardiac arrests. The brain..." "No, doctor," Sarah interrupted him with a conviction that surprised them both. "What I experienced was real, more real than this conversation we're having now. And I received a message that I need to share." The doctor observed her with curiosity. In his 20 years of practice, he had heard various reports of near-death experiences, but something in the way Sarah spoke was different. There was an urgency in her voice, an unshakable certainty in her eyes. "During those minutes," she continued, "I was taken to a place of indescribable light. It wasn't a light that hurt the eyes, but that warmed the soul. And there, I saw him." "Him?" asked the doctor, unable to contain his curiosity. "Jesus," Sarah replied with tears in her eyes. "He showed me things, doctor, things that will happen, revelations about the future that need to be shared." "Doctor..." Richards adjusted his glasses, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Mrs. Johnson, you've been through significant trauma. It's natural that..." "I know it sounds crazy," she interrupted him again, "but I can prove it. You have a daughter named Olivia, who's 7 months pregnant but hasn't told you yet because she's afraid of your reaction, since she's not married." The doctor paled, retreating slightly in his chair. How do you know that?" "He showed me, doctor, just as he showed me much more, 6 events that will change the world as we know it, and we need to prepare." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with meaning. Dr. Richards slowly stood up, still visibly shaken. I'll order some additional tests. You need to rest now." After the doctor left, Sarah closed her eyes again, but not to rest. In her mind, the visions remained vivid. The great deception that was approaching, the awakening that was already beginning to happen, the shaking that would shake the structures of the world, the harvest that would gather the chosen ones, the separation that would reveal the truly faithful, and finally the arrival of the one whom many would mistake for a savior. A different nurse entered the room to check her vital signs. As she approached, she suddenly stopped, staring fixedly at Sarah. "Mrs. Johnson, are you glowing?" Sarah opened her eyes and smiled serenely. "It's just the reflection of the light, dear." But they both knew it wasn't. Something had fundamentally changed in Sarah. She was no longer just a dedicated social worker from Oakridge. Now she was a messenger, a bridge between 2 worlds, and her true mission was just beginning. A week had passed since Sarah was discharged from the hospital. Sitting on her porch in her small apartment in Maplewood, she watched the rising sun paint the Oregon sky with shades of pink and orange. Mount Hood, in the distance, seemed more imposing than ever, as if it too were a silent witness to the revelations she carried. Her cell phone wouldn't stop ringing. The story of her experience had spread quickly through the Community Services Center and the hospital. Dr. Richards, after confirming his daughter Olivia's pregnancy, had shared the incident with some colleagues, and now Sarah was receiving constant interview requests from journalists and invitations from television programs. "Sarah?" The voice of her younger sister Rachel came from the kitchen. "I made a hearty breakfast. You need to eat well." Rachel had temporarily moved into her sister's apartment after her discharge from the hospital, concerned about her recovery. But more than that, she was intrigued and somewhat frightened by the changes she observed in Sarah. Breakfast can wait. "A bit, Rachel," Sarah replied, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Come here for a moment." Rachel approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. As she sat down next to her sister, she noticed again that subtle glow that seemed to emanate from her skin, like a reflection of light that came from nowhere. "You think I'm going crazy, don't you?" Sarah asked softly, turning to face her sister. Rachel hesitated before answering. "It's not that. It's just that all of this is so hard to believe. You've always been the rational one in the family, the one who solved everyone's problems with your feet on the ground." "And I still am." Sarah smiled, taking one of the coffee cups. "But now I know that reality is much bigger than we imagined. What I saw, what I experienced, changed everything, Rachel, and people need to know. But these prophecies you talk about, they're scary. A great deception, a mysterious world leader. It sounds like an apocalyptic movie script." Sarah was silent for a few moments, sipping her coffee. When she spoke again, her voice had a tone of controlled urgency. "Last night, I had another dream vision. I saw multitudes being attracted by false teachers, good and intelligent people being seduced by doctrines that seem right on the surface, but hide poison. And I also saw the awakening beginning, like small lights turning on in the midst of darkness." Rachel put her cup on the small table beside her. "And what do you intend to do with all this?" "I'm going to accept some of the invitations to speak. People need to be warned, they need to prepare. But it won't be easy. I can already feel the resistance, the skepticism, even the hostility I'll face." As if to confirm her words, Sarah's cell phone vibrated again. It was a message from an unknown number. "Stop spreading lies and making fools of people. You're nothing but a charlatan seeking attention." Rachel, who also saw the message, was indignant. "This is absurd. You should report—" "No," Sarah interrupted her with serenity. "This is just the beginning. He warned me there would be opposition. But he also showed me that those who need to hear the message will hear it." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Rachel went to answer and returned accompanied by Mrs. Baker, the receptionist from the center, who brought a basket of bread and fruit. "Mrs. Johnson," Mrs. Baker began, her eyes watery, "you won't believe what happened at the center yesterday." Sarah smiled, indicating a chair for Mrs. Baker to sit down. "Tell me, dear." "That lady, Mrs. Emily, who was with you on the day of the incident, she came back. And you won't believe it, but she had a dream about you. In the dream, you told her she needed to look for her daughter under the bridge near Riverside Park, that today would be the day. She went there, scared, but she went. And she found her daughter, Doctor. The girl was in bad shape, needing help, and agreed to go to the rehab clinic." Rachel and Sarah exchanged significant looks. It was the beginning. The awakening was starting, exactly as had been shown in the visions. "There's one more thing," Mrs. Baker continued, now speaking more quietly, as if sharing a secret. "Some people at the center, they say that since you came back from the hospital, strange things have started to happen. People having prophetic dreams, others reporting inexplicable healings." Sarah stood up from her chair and walked to the window. The sun was now higher, and its rays seemed to converge on Mount Hood, creating a golden halo around it. "It's just the beginning, Betty, just the beginning." The auditorium at the University of Oregon was packed. Sarah observed the crowd settling into their seats, feeling the weight of the responsibility she carried. Rachel, seated in the front row, offered an encouraging smile. 3 months had passed since Sarah's near-death experience, and her story had spread far beyond the limits of Oakridge. What started as local rumors had turned into a phenomenon that attracted the attention of researchers, religious leaders, and skeptics from all over the country. On stage, Sarah was seated between a renowned neuroscientist and a well-known religious leader. The debate would be broadcast live on the internet, and the topic was near-death experiences, hallucination, or spiritual reality. "You claim to have received specific prophecies during your experience," the neuroscientist Dr. Mark Stevens began. "But how can we verify the veracity of these claims?" Sarah adjusted the microphone and looked directly at the audience before responding. "Dr. Stevens, you have a scar on your right knee, the result of a bicycle accident when you were 8 years old. Your mother had warned you about not going down that hill, but you were stubborn." The auditorium fell into absolute silence. Dr. Stevens, visibly disturbed, adjusted his glasses. How? And that's impossible. I've never shared that story publicly. Just as I know this, I also know what's to come, Sarah continued, her voice now firmer. The great deception has already begun. How many of you have already noticed how it's becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish the true from the false? How doctrines that seem liberating actually imprison us? At the back of the auditorium, a woman stood up abruptly. She's telling the truth. My son had been in a coma for 3 months at Mercy General. Last night I dreamed of you, Mrs. Johnson, saying it was time for him to wake up. This morning he opened his eyes. Others in the audience began to speak up, sharing similar experiences. The religious leader, Pastor John, who had been silent until then, leaned towards the microphone. Mrs. Johnson, you speak of a great deception. Can you be more specific? False prophets will arise, she replied, her eyes gaining that characteristic glow that everyone now noticed, but not as we imagine, with religious robes and obviously false speeches. They will come dressed in progress, in misinterpreted science, in philosophies that deny the Spirit while promising liberation, and many, many will be deceived. Suddenly, the auditorium lights flickered, and an inexplicable cold wind swept through the room, making many shiver. Sarah stood up, and that subtle glow emanating from her seemed to intensify. "It's happening now," she said, her voice echoing strangely through the auditorium. "The Great Awakening and the Great Deception, happening simultaneously. Each of you will have to choose which voice to follow, which light to seek." A young student in the front row raised her trembling hand. "How will we know the difference? How to distinguish the true from the false?" Sarah smiled with compassion. "By their fruits you will know them. Truth liberates while lies enslave. Truth unites while lies divide. And most importantly, truth always, always points to love." At that moment, a man in a dark suit hurriedly entered the auditorium, whispering something in the ear of the event organizer. The organizer turned pale and approached the stage. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "we've just received the news. That spiritual leader from India you mentioned in your last interview, the one you said was deceiving millions. He has just been exposed. Leaked documents revealed a $1 million scheme of manipulation and fraud." A murmur ran through the auditorium. 3 weeks earlier, in an interview for a local newspaper, Sarah had spoken specifically about this leader, warning about his true nature. Dr. Stevens stood up, his hands trembling slightly as he held his papers. This is extraordinary. We need to investigate further." "There's no time for prolonged investigations, Doctor," Sarah gently interrupted him. "The great shaking is approaching. The structures we consider unshakable will be shaken. We need to be prepared not just scientifically but spiritually." "And how can we prepare?" someone shouted from the audience. "By cultivating discernment, strengthening our connection with the divine, and mainly keeping our hearts open to love, even and especially in times of darkness." As Sarah spoke, a young reporter in the audience noticed something extraordinary. Her notepad was filling with words, even though she wasn't writing. Frightened, she looked closer and realized they were names of people who, in the coming months, would be exposed as false spiritual leaders. The debate continued for 2 more hours, but something had fundamentally changed in that auditorium. Skeptics began to question their certainties, believers began to deepen their faith, and everyone, without exception, felt they were witnessing something that transcended common human understanding. At the end of the event, as people left the auditorium still impacted, Sarah remained seated, her eyes closed in silent prayer. Rachel, who was in the front row, approached her sister. "Are you okay?" Sarah opened her eyes, and for a moment, Rachel swore she saw golden reflections in her irises. "I am, but this was just the beginning. The real test is yet to come." As they left the auditorium, a small crowd had gathered outside, some seeking blessings, others asking questions, and a few protesting with signs calling Sarah a fraud. Dr. Paul Mendez approached them, his demeanor markedly different from the beginning of the debate. "Miss Sarah," he said, his voice low, I don't know how to explain what happened in there scientifically, but I can't deny what I saw and felt. Would you be willing to participate in a more extensive study? Sarah smiled gently. Dr. Paul, I appreciate your scientific curiosity, but I'm afraid we don't have the luxury of time for extensive studies. The events I've seen are already unfolding. We need to focus on preparing people for what's coming. As if to underscore her words, several people in the crowd suddenly gasped and pointed to the sky. A strange, shimmering light had appeared above the university building, unlike anything they had ever seen before. It's starting, Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the phenomenon. The Great Deception and the Great Awakening, side by side. Each person will have to choose which light to follow. Rachel grabbed her sister's hand, feeling a mix of awe and fear. What do we do now? Sarah turned to face the crowd, her voice carrying with an authority that seemed to come from beyond herself. Go home. Tell your loved ones what you've witnessed. Here, strengthen your bonds of love and compassion, for in the days to come these will be your anchors in the storm that's approaching. As the crowd slowly dispersed, many still glancing at the sky in wonder and confusion, Sarah and Rachel made their way to their car. The city of New York seemed different somehow, as if a veil had been lifted, revealing both shadows and light, that had always been there but never noticed. Rachel, Sarah said as they drove home, I need you to help me set up a meeting. There are others like me who have seen what's coming. We need to coordinate to make sure the message spreads before... It's too late. Rachel nodded, still processing everything she had witnessed. Who are these others? How will we find them? Sarah closed her eyes, that now familiar golden glow emanating from her skin. They'll find us. The first will come from a small town in the Midwest, a farmer who had a vision while working in his fields, then a teacher from California, a nurse from Texas, a fisherman from Maine. They're awakening just as I did. As they pulled up to their apartment building, a man was waiting on the steps. He looked ordinary enough, middle-aged, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made Rachel pause. You're Sarah, aren't you? He said as they approached. I'm John. I think I'm supposed to be here. I saw you in a dream telling me to come to New York. Sarah smiled, unsurprised. Welcome, John. You're right on time. Come inside. We have much to discuss. As the three of them entered the apartment, the strange light in the sky pulsed once more before fading away. In homes across the city, across the country and around the world, people were beginning to stir, awakening to a reality far vaster and more complex than they had ever imagined. The Great Deception was spreading its tendrils, but so too was the Great Awakening. And in a small apartment in New York, a group was forming that would play a pivotal role in the events to come, events that would shake the very foundations of human understanding and belief.